Hey everybody, hope y'all having a happy holiday, having a happy Easter. Not really so much here, I'm just hanging out. I'm thinking that holidays are not going to be too much fun this year for me, but I hope everybody else is having a good one and spending time with family or friends and having fun and doing all that. A lot of stuff to eat and so forth. So I want to do another video. This is inspired by my good friend Bobby Gass. He was yesterday I did the final review of the last Kinks album. I've been doing that for about a year or so, going through the catalog. And got a note from Bobby, says, "Are we done here?" So I'm guessing he's distraught because he must be a big Kinks fan and just sad to see it go. Or maybe he means, are we done being subjected by videos from me? So I'm not really sure. But so I thought just to cheer Bobby up there while he's spending Easter writing love letters to the post office, the Royal Canadian Mail there, and eating ham and hunting for Easter eggs, I would do one final Kinks video. I would rate or rank the Kinks albums from least to best, in my opinion. I guess I've seen people do that with Beatles and solo Beatles and some other groups like that, Pink Floyd, I think. So I thought I'd do that with the Kinks, and I'm just kidding there with Bobby. He knows it. He's a good guy. I'm just busting on him a little bit, having some fun. But still, I thought I would do it all the same. Rank the Kinks albums. So I'm going to do this with just their studio albums. I'm not going to include the live albums or the greatest hits or those things. Just the regular studio albums. Though I will say, I should have prepared a little bit better. I'll say that. I will say that if you're going to go for a live album, my first choice would be the live Kinks from 1967, called the Kinks Live at Kelvin Hall in the rest of the world outside the United States of America. It's a great kind of comparable to the Beatles Live at the Hollywood Bowl or Got Live If You Want It from the Rolling Stones. It's kind of the Kinks at the prime and a lot of 14-year-old girls screaming and carrying on while they're playing their hits. This one's a pretty good one too, from about 14 years later, from 1980, 13 years later. This is kind of their arena rock period, but this is the first Kinks album I got and what got me into the band. So, and then they've got some other live albums that are all pretty good too. I think they've got 5 all told, and most of them are pretty good, but those would be the 2 to go with. If you're looking for greatest hits, there's a thing called the Kinks Greatest Hits that came out in '66, I think, that has all their You Really Got Me All Day and All of the Night, Tired of Waiting for You, all that stuff for their early first 2 or 3 years. That's worth picking up. This one is also worth picking up. Covers like '66 to 1970. Very essential because they didn't have a lot of hits in the United States for reasons that I got into in my videos of the being banned from playing over here for 5 years and whatnot. But this is up there with the Beatles' Red and Blue album, Hot Rocks by the Rolling Stone, Meaty Beaty by the Who. Just one of the greatest hits collections ever. It's a double album. Cool cover. Not a bad song on here. It's just totally essential. And they've got a ton of other greatest hits records and box sets and whatnots. But anyway, so there's the greatest hits and the live albums. There is, track this down too if you can find it. This is a radio copy, Father Christmas, their Christmas song from, was it 1977? Classic Christmas song. It's been put out on a 45, and there's other places you can get it, but one of my favorite Christmas songs. So there's that. So yeah, let us start going through the Kinks here, and I'm going to go from the worst to the best. And the thing about the Kinks, I'm going to try not to comment too much on these individually because I've already done reviews on all of them. But you know me, and I tend to talk, so I probably will all the same. But 30-some year career, and I count 24 studio albums. When I say least to the best, they really rarely ever stepped wrong. They had some that were better than their other stuff, sure, but they if compared to the Rolling Stones that have made a ton of just crap albums, or the Who, or even the solo Beatles, I mean, the Kinks are pretty consistent overall throughout their career for the most part. Even their albums that weren't that great had some really good moments on them, almost without exception. But we got to start somewhere. So at number 24, Phobia, their final studio release. Their final release was actually a live album that I just did a review of yesterday, but I can't really get into this one. And while it's not terrible, it kind of is terrible. There's maybe a couple of tracks on here that are okay, but this is definitely um, a sign that it was probably time for them to break up when they did. It's just not much on here of note, and certainly not the place to start if you're kids getting into the Kinks. Um, so yeah, that was number 24. Number 23, Think Visual. This was their, I'd have to look. I think this was their third to last studio album, and it's actually not very bad. It's got some really good moments on it. Not their best, but it's certainly got its moments. But just not as many moments as the stuff that is coming up after it. Um, we move on, and I should have got the years on this. I think this is 76, might be the 77 album. Sleepwalker, Arista. Again, it's got its moments, but overall, I just never have been able to get into this album all that much. It was pretty popular, I think, all things considered. Where are we? Yeah, number 22, I think. I've already lost count. Preservation Act 2. This was a loosely based on one of their best albums. Ray made these into a kind of a rock opera concept album thing. Actually, 3 albums, because there's another album coming up. This is part 2 of Preservation Act. It does have some pretty good stuff on it, but it has some pretty crap stuff on it. And it's interesting because there's some musical genres on here that the Kinks go through that you don't usually see the Kinks playing, get out of their sound a little bit. But overall, it's kind of a convoluted mess. Uh, Up next is, I think we are at, I don't know what number we are. We're just going to go through. Up next is UK Jive. This is their second to last, I believe, studio album, and this one I actually pretty well like. It's got some moments on it. It's just not a bad album. It's not the place to start again with the Kinks, but not a bad thing. Then next up we got Misfits, which is 76 or 77. This one came out after Sleepwalker, or before. I get mixed up on which came first, but anyway. It's got its moments too, some pretty good stuff. Not great, but not terrible. Then we come to, I think their 1973 album, Everybody's in Show Business. It's a double album. Half of it is live album, the studio album, and then the second album is live. It's got a Celluloid Heroes is probably the most famous song off of this, which is not a bad song, but it's a little bit too long. Here Comes Yet Another Day is pretty good. Hot Potatoes, Sitting in My Hotel. Um, Pretty good stuff. Things are getting better, though. We talked about Preservation Act 2, so now we'll talk about Preservation Act 1, which is single album and quite a bit better than Preservation Act 2, which came out a year or so after it. Sweet Lady Genevieve, Where Are They Now, One of the Survivors, Sitting in the Midday Sun's really good song. Morning Song, the first introduction, I kind of like. So we're still not into classic Kinks yet, but this is all pretty good stuff and worth checking out where we are right now. Now we're getting a little better. Word of Mouth. This is from 1985. It's got some of from the Kinks' second wave of popularity period, and their kind of arena rock in the 80s days. Do It Again is great. Living on a Thin Line might be their last truly great song. Good Day is really, really, really a nice song. Massive Reductions. So A little bit too 80s in moments on this, but still a solid, good album. That one's worth tracking down and picking up. Those aren't going to cooperate with me. Next up, Soap Opera. This is another one of the rock concept albums of the 70s. And this one got pretty trashed, but I really like this album. I was thinking this was going to be terrible because I just got it last year or so, and I avoided it because it gotten such bad reviews. But better than I thought it was going to be. Facing the Crowd, Ducks on the Wall, Ordinary People's pretty good. And as far as a rock opera, it's kind of the Prince and the Pauper, where they switch places, a rock star and an ordinary guy. A little bit silly, but not as silly as, say, Preservation Act 2. Not as silly as, say, Tommy by The Who, which is a good album, but just a silly storyline. Good, kind of a, it's a bit silly storyline, but it's at least interesting, and it's good songs. Good songs on that one. Next up, State of Confusion, 1983. Had one of their biggest hits, Come Dancing, which some people love, some people hate. But I like it, but there's a lot of other great. Title track's good. Definitely Maybe is great. Don't Forget to Dance. Bernadette's pretty good. So 1983, I saw them in 1983 when they were touring that album. Next up, this is another 70s concept rock opera thing. Stupid cover. Back cover's better. Schoolboys in Disgrace, 1975. This is my favorite of the, well, with one exception, this is my favorite of the Ray Davies concept albums. Two exceptions, actually. But School Days, Jack the Idiot Dunce, First Time We Fall in Love, I'm in Disgrace, The Hard Way, No More Looking Back. Great songs, all of them. This one got kind of not a great reputation when it was released, but time has been kind to it. This is really worth, of their 70s albums, this is not the best, but this is one that's definitely worth seeking out and checking out. This would be one to pick up. We go to 1981 next, Give the People What They Want, kind of their return to form after the live album One for the Road from 1980. I bought this when it was new. This is got some great songs. Give the People What They Want's great. Around the Dial, Killer's Eyes, Added Up, Destroyer, Art Lover, Better Things. The rest of the stuff on here is not bad either. So solid album, pretty much start to finish. Excuse me, not their best again, but very, very good and worth checking out. I mean, there's some people that like their 60s stuff and aren't too fond of their late 70s, early 80s revival of popularity, kind of rock star MTV, arena rock days, and that's understandable. But I kind of like that stuff too, even though it's not as good as their 60s stuff. Next up, Muswell Hillbillies from 1971. When I reviewed this, I didn't give it that great of a review, but having listened to it a lot since then, it's grown on me. And there is quite a bit of good stuff on here, and it really, the more takes a while to grow on you, I guess, or it did for me, but it is a pretty solid start to finish album, and it is worth picking up. We're getting closer into the golden age, but not quite yet. We go to this is what kicked off their 80s, late 70s, early 80s revival, really. Low budget, 1979. Sounds like a 1979 album, but good stuff. The title track. There's really not a bad song on here, so I'm not going to read every song. I'm thinking Moving Pictures is just okay, but pretty much everything. Misery's just okay, but the rest of this album is great, and that's one worth picking up. So that would be, and where are we? And I've got that at number 11 on the count up, I guess is what it is. Next up is Lola. Not a bad song on here, 1970. This is their first hit in America in several years, because this is the first time that they were able to come back and tour America. Actually, in 1969 they were, but this is their first hit in quite a while in America. The title track. But the title track is great, but the rest of the album is just as great or better, and it's definitely a must-have. From here on out, everything is pretty much a must-have. Let's see. Next up, at number 9, I think it is Kinda Kinks, which I also have on the double deluxe edition CD, but with bonus tracks and whatnot. This is their second album from 1964, I believe, or early 65. Here's a couple of American albums, just because they did the same with the Kinks as they did with the Rolling Stones and the Beatles in America, where they would leave certain tracks off of the British albums so that they could put together extra albums that never really existed per se. But just thought you might want to see that. Which one are we up to? Next up, the Great Lost Kinks album from 1973. This was when they went from the Reprise label to RCA label. Reprise released a lot of songs that had never been released, and they're all from like 66 to 1970. Not a bad song on here. It's a 10. It's a classic album, and it's also pretty hard to find because it's out of print. Number 8, I think we're at. I might be off my count. Their debut, You Really Got Me, one of the greatest songs of all time, of course, from 64. Here's the British version on CD. I don't have it on vinyl, unfortunately. As far as debuts go, this is not as good as the Beatles, and there's a lot of cover songs on here, but it's still really good. It's about comparable to the Rolling Stones. Maybe the Rolling Stones get a little bit better. And so, yeah, great album all the same. We get to Kinks Controversy next, which is where Ray's songwriting starts to get spread out a little bit and a little more developed. Not a bad song on this one. Classic cover, and just a perfect album. And what are we up to? Now we're getting into the golden age. Something else, 67, Waterloo Sunset, David Watts. We're at perfection now, so it's really just a matter of degrees. 1969's best album by anybody by far, Arthur. And this is a concept rock opera album and the greatest one ever made, and not a bad track on it. Everybody needs to buy this album today if they don't have it. We get to number 2, Face to Face, 1966. Sunny Afternoon's the hit. Everything else on there is just as good or better. And we get to the Kinks' best album and the second best album of all time. And that doesn't really need much introduction other than to say, if you don't have it, you need it. Best album in 1968. They'd already done, they would do the best album in 1969, the next year. I could go on about this album, but you've seen my videos on it. If you haven't, you can watch those. It's, like I said, my second favorite album of all time. And so there you go.